Although I'm aware of the fact that this is not a Python course and that you maybe never worked with Python before, we will now simply implement this logic because it actually doesn't require a lot of code to create this chat-like experience. We'll get started with this slightly updated code compared to our initial example. The code here only contains minor updates. I just renamed completion to response, and instead of just printing the entire response, I stored the code to access the content of the response, we learned that already, in the AI response variable to then print this response with a nicer interface. So therefore, if we run this code now, we get this U interface to ask our question, like what is JavaScript? And then we get back the answer. So we have this U as we defined it here in the input, and we have this AI answer because we printed it down here. And then this AI response variable contains the content of the response. So this is nothing new. It's just a slightly updated and restructured code. The problem with this code still is that we can only create one request and response round, so to say. So if I would ask, what did I write in my last prompt, for example, I will get back something like this. So the API doesn't have access to any previous prompts because we basically left this conversation after the first round was completed. So we have two things to tackle. First, we need to stay inside this conversation, meaning we don't have to rerun the script all the time. Instead, when starting the script, we should stay in this loop, so to say, and only when we quit it manually, for example, we will exit it. And secondly, as long as we stay inside this loop, so inside this conversation, we have to make sure that all previous messages, questions, and answers are stored to be available as context for the API response. Let's get started with this storing information topic. Because as mentioned, the messages parameter is the one that holds all the information that we need for the context of our conversation. So we somehow need to find a way to store and add information to this parameter. Therefore, to get started, we can simply add an empty list, because in the end, our messages parameter will be a list. Therefore, we'll just add the chat messages variable. A variable always stores information, and this will just be an empty list at the beginning. The code is always executed from top to bottom. This means when running our script, we will first create this empty list, then we will add our user input. And as our messages parameter in the end should contain all questions and answers, we can simply add or append the user message, so what the user wrote, to our empty list first. For that, we refer to the chat messages variable, and now use an integrated Python function, the append function, that allows us to append or add an object to a list. As we are using a list up here, this kind of makes a lot of sense. But we need to add a specific object to this list, and this object again is a dictionary. Because remember, we also have dictionaries in here in our messages parameter. So we first add the curly braces here. Now we add the role, which should be what? The user. And the second key now is again the content, and our content is not hard-coded, but instead it should be our user message. So this is the user side. With that, we should be able to store our user input. But what about the response down here? It actually is exactly the same logic. We can just again refer to our chat messages list, use the append function, and now instead of assigning the role of user, we assign the assistant role in here. And the content of the assistant is the content of the AI response. And this content here is stored in the corresponding variable that we actually named AI response. So what we did now is, after adding our user message to our list, after receiving the response, we also added this response to our list here with the role of assistant. So with this, we have the logic to store our questions and answers in the chat messages variable, so inside this list. The only thing we have to do is we have to update our messages now, because messages should no longer be just a single user role and the user message that was added. Instead, we now simply add our entire chat messages in here. So if I now rerun our code, with the good old banana question, then nothing changed. But when adding another print function down here, that now prints the chat messages object. And by rerunning the code again, then we see our list that we created containing all the different dictionaries, so basically two now, one for the user role with our question, what is a banana, and the assistant answer with the corresponding output. So this means we now found a way to store our questions and the answers we received. The only missing thing is now to create a logic to stay inside this script, so to say, to build up on the conversation, to keep asking and not having to rerun this Python chatpy code again and again. Because once we leave our script here, all this information is lost. Because this information is not stored anywhere, it's just stored internally in the memory, so to say. And once you leave this current session, so to say, all stored information will be lost. The good thing is that creating such loops, as we call it, is very easy. We only have to add the following code, while true. And now we take all the existing code that we had below that while statement and indent it. What simply happens here now is that when executing the code, we enter this loop. So we enter this code inside this while loop. And while this is true, so basically as long as we don't exit our code execution manually with Ctrl-Z here, the code will run again and again. So this means the code will start up here with the empty list, then access this loop. So we will have to add our user message. We will append the message to our list. Then the request will be sent, the response will be generated, and the response will be added to our chat messages. Then the loop starts again with a new user message, a new question. We add this second question, and so on. So with this logic, we should now be able to have a ChatGPT-like chat experience. So let's see. Tell me something about Barcelona, for example. And now about Paris. And as we already see, we store the entire conversation in here and print it to the screen with our print statement. So this was the initial question. Here we have the second question and then the corresponding answer. And now I could say, what was my first question? And if everything worked as intended, we should get back an answer like this. Your first question was, tell me something about Barcelona. And one thing I wanted to add, whenever you are now inside this loop asking your questions and getting your responses, and then you suddenly realize that you actually want to stop this loop and exit the code execution, you can always do this with Control Z. This will terminate the script execution. To have less text also in the output, you can also comment out the chat messages print function down here. So we now hopefully understood how the API generally works, how the different parameters have an impact onto the API, and how the messages parameter is a very important one as it stores all the information that we used in the conversation, and by implementing such a loop logic, we can also create a ChatGPT-like chat experience. Only as long as the code execution is not interrupted though, but still this works pretty well actually. In addition to that, we also learned some basics about Python hopefully. However, as mentioned, rebuilding ChatGPT is nice, but the API actually has endless possibilities, so you can basically build anything with this API. I want to give you some more examples at hand, and more importantly, we'll also explore another role. Because in addition to user and assistant, there is another pretty interesting role that we need to create our next little application.